there's good content here, but it is a little dense at times. So buckle up and hold on tight. So let's go ahead and get started. So again, welcome everyone to today's webinar on the costs keep rising and now what? My name is Garrett Martin. I'm the president and CEO of the Maine Center for Economic Policy. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Maine Center for Economic Policy, we do research and analysis on economic issues affecting Maine people. We're particularly concerned with making sure that all Mainers have a fair shot at a good life. We sort of occupy three different roles in the state. One is we're a backbone organization to good governance. So I know we have some representatives and state senators on the webinar today. They're certainly familiar with the dynamic of being term limited and part-time. They also are probably familiar with not having a lot of staff around them to help develop policy proposals. While there's a great team at the State House that does that, I think sometimes our experience has been that just as lawmakers are getting effective at their craft, they tend to be termed out. And so we provide both institutional memory and additional capacity to support good decision making through the legislative process. We also are a strategic partner to a number of groups around the state who are engaged in improving outcomes for low and moderate income people. We were in the lead with a number of other organizations to advance the minimum wage, to expand Medicaid, to bring paid family medical leave to Maine. And those are just a few of the examples of some of the policy outcomes we've helped work toward in coalition with other partners. And then finally, we provide information and analysis for the media on economic policy issues. So some of you may know we have a weekly spot on WGME Channel 13 out of Portland talking about economic issues. We regularly are cited in the media, and last year we were cited on average at least one time a day through the course of the year. So that's both gratifying in a small state like Maine, where you can touch and see and feel the work, but also an important function in terms of helping the public more broadly understand these issues. So that's part of what today's presentation is about. Let's dig in and talk a little bit about the rising costs that we see and how that came to be, and sort of maybe start thinking about a path forward. And I think what's important to acknowledge at the outset is there are immediate things that are impacting cost that many of us are probably familiar with. But this is not just a story about rising cost. It's also a story about what's happened with wages over time. And we see there that perhaps wages have not kept pace with both inflation and with the rising productivity we see in our economy more broadly. And then finally, there is the outcome of inequality that has gotten significantly more pronounced over the last 50 years, in part because of a rig tax code that ultimately is allowing for greater and greater accumulation of wealth and income at the top of the income ladder, and actually leaving more and more people behind at the bottom of the income ladder. So that's the basic summation, but let's get into the details around this. So the first thing I want to just ask folks is, when you think about your household situation and finances, what feels harder than it did a few years ago? So feel free to chime in the chat with some thoughts there. When you think about your financial situation, what feels harder than it did a few years ago? So I'll give you a second to do that. All right, we're seeing a couple of folks chime in. We've got heating costs, saving money, groceries. Groceries are a million times more. Yes. I feel like I can't go into the grocery store anymore without paying more than at least $70 on even basic items. Cost of autos. Yes. Utilities. Yes. AMK, the full-time caregiver not getting paid. I know we've talked about that before. So I think you all have flagged a number of things that are resonant for a lot of people. And I just want to share some national survey data on this issue, this question, if you will. And what we see is this is a tracking poll that KFF has produced over a number of years. And consistently, healthcare costs is something that pops across the board and over time. And in Maine, we see that reflected in a couple of ways. First of all, 1 out of every 2 households in the last 2 years has experienced medical debt in Maine. That is crazy. So if you think about 50% of households having experienced medical debt in the last 2 years, that tells you something about what's going on with healthcare costs and people's ability to afford it. Hospital costs have risen 3.5 times more than the cost of everyday goods. And then what we see more recently in the KFF tracking poll is certainly greater awareness around fuel cost. Again, I don't think anybody here needs to be convinced of that. Groceries, utilities, and rent and mortgage fees. Now, the reality is when you see such a large percentage of the population concerned with these rising costs, that suggests that it's not about individual choices. It is about a structural or systemic challenge within our broader economy. So, given that as background, let's talk a little bit about what the current administration has done to address the affordability crisis. Because remember that when this administration came into office, one of their chief points for why they should be elected was that they were going to help bring it down costs for American people. And I think it's important to note that those costs were triggered in part by the COVID pandemic, Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, and other disruptions to the supply chain. But so let's talk about what this administration has done as costs have been going up. The first thing that bears mentioning is the war. So when the war started in February, gas prices on average in Maine were roughly $2.92 a gallon. They've peaked at $4.50, 53 cents statewide. They're now down a little bit. There's talk that they may go up again. But for Maine households, obviously, this represents a significant increase in cost. There are other ways in which the war is triggering cost increases. So groceries, for instance, while we have already seen higher costs for groceries on account of the tariffs, we're likely to see even more increases on account of the war. And that stems from two things. First of all, is what's happened with the supply chain for fertilizer and those inputs, and choices that producers are making about what they plant based on the availability of those products that help increase their yields. The other part of that is the transportation costs associated with those goods. Another key place in which the war is driving up costs for households has to do with what's going on in the interest rate environment. And so mortgage costs have gone up. So if you were to have bought a house before this war began, and on an average typical mortgage for the typical median house in Maine, say a $250,000, $300,000 mortgage over 30 years, if you bought that house today versus buying it before the war began, you will be paying roughly $35,000 to $40,000 more over the course of that 30-year mortgage as a result of the increased cost of mortgage. So that's just the near-term effects of the war. But let's talk about more concretely some of the economic policies of this administration and what they mean to the bottom line of Maine people. So this administration effectively has had three sort of areas of endeavor aimed at addressing economic challenges that households are facing and strengthening our economy more broadly. The first part was tax cuts. So last year, they passed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act in 2025, and that bill primarily centered tax cuts that disproportionately benefited wealthy and large corporations. So $4.5 trillion tax cut plan. So that said, most Maine families are going to see a slight benefit from that proposal, and they will see some additional money in their pocket as a result of the increased tax refund associated with those policy changes. The second set of policies that this administration has pursued is tax increases. And so that's what the tariffs represent. The tariff regime of this administration has effectively raised the cost of everyday goods that all of us buy. And there's information that suggests that on average, it's raising costs by about $1,600 a year for the typical Maine household. And then the third area of policy for this administration around the economy has to do with healthcare cuts. So cuts to healthcare represent a significant part of the overall economic plan. And what we see is in combination with the 4.5 trillion in tax cuts that were granted through the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, we have roughly $1 trillion in cuts to healthcare through the same measure. And that's the largest cut to healthcare access in our nation's history. In Maine, that may translate to about 65,000 people losing access to health insurance. But in addition to that, we have the failure to extend the enhanced premium tax credits. And those tax credits ultimately benefited people who were slightly higher up on the income ladder. So people above 400% of poverty, what it meant was that they, and for an individual, that's roughly $60,000, $62,000 a year. What it meant was they didn't have to spend more than 8% of their income on their health insurance. Because that went away, they are now no longer protected from that. And so the people who have been hit hardest by the failure to extend the enhanced premium tax credit are actually people who are working small business owners farmers, fishermen, and people between the age of 55 and 64. So in Maine, a couple age 62 earning somewhere around $78,000 a year to maintain the same coverage that they had through the Maine marketplace, they would have to pay $30,000 more as a consequence of the failure to extend the enhanced premium tax credit. There's no way they're going to do that. And so more than likely, they're either going to get a less good plan, still at a higher cost than what they were paying before, or they're going to go without. And at least in my life, I see that around me in my community. I have friends who are in their 50s, who both of whom work, and for the first time in their lives, they're going without health insurance because of the failure to extend the enhanced premium tax credits. So that gives you a flavor of some of the impacts of this administration's economic plan. And when we tally it all up, what we see is, yes, there's a benefit to the tax plan in terms of the tax cuts. About roughly $350 on average was what the average increase in tax refunds were. And this is a national figure from the IRS. And then the tariffs are actually costing people, again, roughly $1,600. The gas price increase is roughly $700. And who knows, again, what the healthcare cost increase looks like. Because what we know is that you can't control when you get sick. You, depending on your coverage and whether you have a high deductible plan, what gets covered, what doesn't, in network, out of network, we all know this game. The impacts are significant for many families and many households. So that's one picture of what's happening with costs. But I want to, before I move on to the next issue, I want to flag some other ways in which this administration's policies are impacting Maine's economy. So MECEP did some analysis on the ice surge earlier this year and what it meant for the economy more broadly. And what we saw was a roughly $10 to $22 million reduction in economic activity related to the ice surge that occurred earlier this year. And that was attributed to, again, people sort of remaining in place, not showing up for work, a whole host of things that sort of curtailed economic activity during that period of time. There's also an ongoing loss of economic activity that's associated with removing workers from our economy. So many of the people who were removed from our state were actually people who were working. And you know what's so interesting about this is anybody you talk to is concerned about our worker shortage and the need to grow our economy by, in part, attracting more workers to the state. Well, it turns out that one of the primary ways we've done that through the years is through immigration. This has had a chilling effect, and by removing those people out of the workforce, you have a longer-term economic consequence. Now, the surge may be over, but they're still active in our state, and they're still, those economic consequences will continue to reverberate as those activities persist. The other area where we've seen this is with the trade war with Canada. And again, we looked at the data about what happens on border communities associated with economic activity, in part because the data was very clear. We are seeing significantly fewer border crossings, roughly 800,000 fewer border crossings last year as a consequence of the tariffs and the trade war. And in border areas, you can see that while the rest of the state has seen an increase in sales across all sort of items, border communities saw a pretty significant reduction. Restaurant and lodging tells an even clearer picture that way. And I will say that we included Old Orchard Beach in this analysis, in part because I happened to be down in DC visiting with Senator King when the trade war started, if you will. And there was a hotel owner from Old Orchard Beach who was in Senator King's office at the same time. And he was lamenting the fact that the day after that happened, he got 4 cancellations from visitors from Canada who had been longtime visitors to his establishment. And so we thought, well, gee, if this is a hub of Canadian activity, we should consider looking at that. And sure enough, the data bears out that individual's experience. There has been a reduction in restaurant and lodging associated, again, with the fewer border crossings in our state. So talked about the cost increases associated with this administration's current policies, acknowledged that costs were going up even before they came in part because of disruptions to the global economy. But the story is actually a much deeper story than that. It's not just about near-term increases in costs. It's also a story about what's happened with wages and what's happened with our tax code. So let's talk a little bit about what's happened with wages. But before we do, sorry, I'm out of step. Let's talk about who's winning under the current administration's policy proposals. And the people who are winning are these guys. So this is at the inauguration. You have Mark Zuckerberg, CEO of Meta, Facebook. You have Jeff Bezos, CEO of Amazon. You have Sundar Pichai, who is the CEO of Alphabet and Google, and then Elon Musk, the CEO of Tesla. The four corporations that these individuals are in charge of managed to pay $51 billion less in taxes than they otherwise might have on account of the tax cuts that were enacted by the Trump administration. If you paid income tax last year, you actually paid more in tax than Tesla and Palantir. Both those corporations paid $0 in taxes. So there are 310 corporations that earned more than $1 trillion in profits that managed to avoid roughly $147 billion in taxes last year because of the proposals of this administration. That's one example. I think the other thing is when you look at, again, at the tax cuts in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, roughly 1.5 trillion of those goes to households with income above $500,000. And so you can begin to see that costs are going up, but there are still some winners on account of the policy levers that are being pulled. And the bulk of those winners are the folks you see in this picture and people like them. So let's talk about then the other side of the ledger, which is what's happening with wages. And what we know about wages is that while our economy continues to be productive, there was a point in time where wages no longer moved in lockstep with gains to production. And this is a slide that portrays that data. The Economic Policy Institute is the organization that has put that out for a number of years. And what you see is productivity gains have gone up by 81%. And since the late 1970s, while hourly pay, hourly wages has largely been flatlined. What that means is that we see increasing inequality between what workers are being paid and what shareholders and CEOs are getting paid. So in the late 70s, the typical CEO earned roughly 25 times more than the average worker. Today, that's roughly 380 to 1. And for large corporations, particularly low-wage corporations, that can be even more dramatic. So a corporation like Starbucks, for instance, the CEO earns roughly 6,000 times more than the average worker. So the average worker would effectively have to work for 18 years before they earned what the CEO earns in one day. So that's one example of wages not keeping pace. We know from the recent inflation data that wages are actually falling behind what the increasing cost of goods is looking like. But the other part of the story is even when wages have kept pace, there are some things in our economy where the cost of those goods have gone up significantly more than the cost of inflation. So higher education, healthcare costs. So if you're an individual who has a need for those things, you may be keeping pace with the broader economic inflation figure, but you're not keeping pace with what it is for you and your family. And to the question about whether or not this is adjusted for inflation, I believe it is. I can confirm that, but I'm pretty sure that it is. So the other part of the story, though, is the tax code. So the tax code has supercharged inequality and shortchanged communities. And what this growing inequality means is that the affordability challenge gets harder for people. So many of us have heard about what's called the K-shaped recovery. The K-shaped recovery means that there are people at the top who are benefiting significantly from and continue to benefit from the gains of economic productivity, while people at the bottom are falling further and further behind. And I think the best example I can give of sort of what this looks like in practice is if you look at what happened with Delta Airlines last year. Delta Airlines was profitable. The bulk of their profits came from offering premium services. So at the front of the aircraft, they were doing a lot of things to cater to the wealthier clientele, the business elites who traveled at the front of the cabin. Meanwhile, in the back of the plane, the seats are getting closer together. There are fewer services being offered, and it's just not as good a deal. And so you have an amenity-based economy that's serving the needs of those at the top versus a needs-based economy that's addressing sort of broadly shared concerns of the population. And another place where that plays out is in the housing market. Who are the builders going to build for? They're not going to build for a typical working person or a single mom with a kid who can only afford a house of a certain level. They're going to build for the people who can afford the best and biggest house they can make. So there are plenty of ways in which our economy has been distorted to cater to the needs of those at the top. which is resulting in less affordability for those at the bottom. But let's talk about some of the ways in which the tax code has supercharged inequality in recent years and over the last 50 years. The first way that I think really bears mentioning is that our tax code currently rewards wealth over work. And the best way to exemplify that is by looking at how much does a couple that's earning $150,000 a year pay in taxes depending on their source of income. If that income came from wages, they pay roughly $28,000 in federal income tax and payroll taxes. If it comes from capital gains, meaning they have a stock portfolio and they sell off some stock, long-term gains to fund that $150,000 ongoing income, they'll pay $4,000 or even less, depending on which brackets they're in at the end of the day. And if they inherited that $150,000, they'll pay nothing. So that's one example of how our tax code is structured in such a way that it ultimately is rewarding folks who already have wealth or who have inherited wealth, while people who are working are paying significantly more. And one way in which we see this play out is in hedge fund managers. Hedge fund managers don't claim wages for income, because if they did, they would pay significantly more in taxes. Instead, they claim capital gains as their source of income, which allows them to exact a premium on what they pay in taxes. So it's little wonder that when you look at the growth of billionaires in this country, a significant share of those come from that industry. The other place in which our tax code reveals sort of inequality in the relationship between our tax system and broader economic prosperity is by looking at the top rates of taxation over the last 100 years or so. And at its peak, the top marginal rate was 94% in 1945. Why was it 94% in 1945? Well, we had a war at that time. And so in order to fund the war effort, there was a need to raise revenue to do the things that we did. And that 94% was not applied on all income below a certain threshold. It was only applied on income above the threshold. So at the time, it was around $200,000, which in today's terms represents about $3.5 million. But what's more interesting in this picture is when you think about the period of most broadly shared prosperity in our nation's history, meaning as productivity increased, wages increased at comparable levels for low-income workers as well as middle-income workers as well as upper-income workers. It was during this period between the 1940s and the late 1960s, early 1970s, when our tax code also supported investments in things that promoted opportunity for middle and lower income households. So investments in home ownership, investments in education. So it turns out that if you want good things, you have to actually raise the resources to invest in those good things so that it makes it more possible for a broader segment of the population to benefit from those. Our roads and bridges, the build out of our public infrastructure, all came during that same time period. But let's look at over that same timeline, what's happened with income inequality. And what we see here is that income inequality was at its lowest, again, around 1945, when the top 10% of households claimed about 34% of all income. Today, we're at historic levels of inequality as it relates to income. So the top 10% account for roughly 55% of income. Wealth inequality is significantly greater. So wealth inequality, what we see is that the top 10% hold roughly 75% of all wealth. And another example of that is how the top 10% hold roughly 90% of equities in the stock market. So those are some very troubling trends. But what's even more troubling and potentially elucidating is when you look at the two of them together. And what we see is this inverse relationship, and certainly correlation isn't causality, but in this case, there is very well documented sort of information that suggests certainly that our tax code is allowing more and more resources to flow to the top and more wealth to be held among a smaller and smaller group of people, which is creating this environment in which we have an economy that, again, isn't working for folks in the middle or on the lower end. It's primarily working for those at the top. And we see that in the data again, in that we have a growing group of people at the top. We have a growing group of people in the bottom. And what we're losing is we're actually losing people in the middle. We have a smaller share of middle income households relative to all other households. And that has impacts on our democracy and how it functions, on where we choose to invest, and again, how markets work to the benefit of the broader population. So, given all that background, what you've got now is there are near-term policies that have driven up cost. There's the reality of wages not keeping pace and families feeling even more squeezed by the economic realities that creates. And then we have this supercharged system, rig tax code, that's exacerbating these trends by creating incentives for more resources to flow to the top and to undercut investments in programs and services that benefit and create opportunity for everyone else. So let's talk about the roots of today's crisis. And let's acknowledge, too, that this has been 5 decades in the making, that Democrats, Republicans, independents alike have signed on to policy proposals that are part of the problem, not part of the solution, and that understanding these is foundational to not only addressing the current affordability crisis, but also to ensuring that we have an economy that works for everyone and that we have a strong democracy that reflects the interests and desires of a broader segment of the population. So that really is reflected in 3 different areas. The triple threat to prosperity is driven, again, by this inequality that's occurred through our economic system. And what its results are, in some respects, and the drivers as a consequence, are in these 3 areas. So public disinvestment represents, again, a retrenchment. If tax policy is how you raise the resources to invest in communities and promote opportunity for people in some respects, if you have fewer resources, you're providing fewer opportunities in those regards. And I think there are a couple of clear examples that stand out for people in that space. One is what's happened with higher education. Higher education is an area where the costs have gone up significantly more than the cost of inflation. And so it's little wonder that working families are challenged to avail themselves of that opportunity. And in my side hustle is I coach my local cross country and track team, and the kids that I work with in that space, I know that, for instance, free community college in the state of Maine has been a game changer. There are kids who are now going on to community college who would never have dreamed of going on to higher education because they couldn't afford it. And that's increasingly the reality because of the public disinvestment that has occurred in a number of different spaces. So we're pushing those costs that we used to cover through our shared commitment to providing opportunity and building ladders to success for people into the individual family bucket, into privatizing that. So the other space we see this is in predatory markets. So, I think most people can appreciate the reality of sort of this algorithm-based economy that we have, where we don't have perfect information. The information, the transparency that our economic theory tells us is necessary for markets to function well doesn't exist. And so we as consumers are actually paying more. The corporations that are the large entities are using their outsized market power to both drive out competition. So mom and pop shops on Main Street, smaller competitors. And then ultimately by doing so, they're able to control the pricing of their products. We, as a result, as consumers, are paying more. And there are estimates that suggest that the current nature of our sort of predatory marketplace means that most Americans are paying somewhere around $5,000 more a year on the goods and services that they consume because of dysfunctions in the market that are driven, again, by outsized power and influence of a few key actors. This also shows up for wages. And so our tax code currently supports and props up a system in which companies are incentivized not to reinvest in their company or to pay their workers more. They're incentivized to actually buy back their stocks. And that increases the value of the company for shareholders, for owners, but it may not necessarily mean much for workers and consumers. And in fact, if you look at a company like Lowe's, the amount of money that they've used to buy back stock over the last 5 years, if they had allocated that to increasing wages for workers, they could have raised the wages of the 270,000 workers who work at Lowe's by $30,000 a worker over the last 5 years, in each of the last 5 years. So again, you see how this outsized market share, predatory markets not only hurts consumers, it hurts workers as well. And then finally, we have the RIG tax code. And I've talked enough about sort of how we reward wealth over work, how our top rates have come down over time, particularly the income and the corporate tax rates, and how that means we have fewer resources to invest in our communities and in promoting opportunities that make a difference in people's lives. But I'll leave you with one other example around the rigging of our tax code that's actually tied to public disinvestment. So one of the things that's happening under this administration, and that has happened over time, is a reduction in investment in public goods and in public services. Now, one public entity that's been on the receiving end of this is the Internal Revenue Service. And so the Internal Revenue Service, if they had the capacity to enforce our tax laws and ensure that people who owed, and I'm not talking about low-income people who maybe didn't file their taxes, because that's pennies on the dollars. Everybody should file their taxes, don't get me wrong. But I'm talking about where the money really is. And the money is really with wealthy people and large corporations. If we made sure that those people paid what they owed by law, we're not talking about loopholes that they're exploiting legally, but just putting in place the law that we currently have, we would raise an additional $600 to $700 billion a year at the federal level in taxes. Now, I know we use terms like billion, million, trillion a lot, but what does that mean? Well, $600 to $700 billion a year is enough to pay for universal childcare nationally and universal public higher education nationally and paid family medical leave and the child tax credit expansion that we saw during COVID that actually reduced child poverty by half. So these are choices that are being made to disinvest in ways that reduce the resources available to ultimately support and bolster opportunity for all Americans, not just those at the top, who are getting off without paying their fair share. So when you look at these, you see the roots, the rig tax code, the predatory markets, the disinvestment, and the results: less affordability, less economic security, democracy at risk, and increased inequality, as we've discussed before. So let's talk a little bit about what we can do about this. I think it's really important for people to remember, and what we've seen in our surveying at Maine Center for Economic Policy is that whether people are Republican, Democrat, Independent, they all get it. They're all feeling squeezed. They appreciate that this economy feels like it's not working for them. And we saw another example of that just the other day. Brookings Institution released some data that showed that roughly 46% of Mainers don't earn enough to meet their basic needs on an ongoing basis. These are people who are working. And that data is supported by other research and analysis that shows somewhere between 40 and 45% of households are really struggling to get by. But what we need to remember is that we do have the power. And it's not just about who has the greatest amount of money or who has the greatest access to those in positions of power, because ultimately we do live in a democracy. And when we've seen historically that when the people give voice to what their needs and desires and wants are, we can see change happen. And the Boston Tea Party is one example of that. I think a lot of times people sort of misconstrue what the Boston Tea Party was ultimately about. It was actually a protest of the guaranteed monopoly that had been granted to the East India Company to allow them to sell their tea and then get basically a rebate on the taxes they paid so that they could undercut their competition in the colonies. That is, that's the reality. It would be as if somebody protested today how Starbucks is allowed to have greater power over its market share and ultimately undercut their competition if they didn't have to pay as much in taxes as the little guys on Main Street. Another example of where people power has made a big difference comes around the adoption of the 16th Amendment, which is the income tax, what made it possible to have a federal income tax in this country. And what we see is that after the Civil War, we reverted to a system in which we used tariffs to primarily fund public services. But people out west and farmers started to appreciate that tariffs were actually increasing their costs. And it was hurting them, their bottom line, and making their goods more costly to the people who were seeking to buy them. And that there had to be a better way to fund services like mail service and provision of roads and schools, particularly, again, out west, but also in the South. And so there was the passage of an income tax. but that was deemed unconstitutional by the Supreme Court at the time in 1864 or 1896. And so, in order to address that, Congress put the 16th Amendment out. And initially, they thought, it's not going to go anywhere. But it turns out that people in the West and people in the South, again, appreciated that not only did they want good things, but they needed to fund those things. And the best way to fund it from their perspective was through an income tax, in part because where the wealth was largely back east among the industrialists, among that class of people who had significant wealth and accrued it on the backs of those workers who had moved along. And so it passed in those places. But a holdout state was New York. Why was New York a holdout? Well, it was a holdout in part because J.D. Rockefeller, who was the wealthiest man in the world at the time, tried to block it. And he tried to block it in two ways. He brought his lawyers to court. They contested it again and again. But he also paid for the opposition campaign to keep it from passing. Sound familiar? Ultimately, people rose up and they said, wait a second, there is a better way to fund the services that we want. And it is through the income tax. And so that's what we're going to do. So I think that's an important thing for people to bear in mind, is that we have the power to structure the rules of our economy and how it works in the same way that we've allowed the rules of our economy to be structured in the last 5 decades in ways that ultimately aren't working. They were based on a theory of how things would trickle down and benefit the rest of us that isn't bearing out in practice. And so we need to go back, revisit those rules, and make sure we're changing our economy in a way that not only is addressing people's concerns about rising costs, but supporting them and having higher wages, and ultimately undercutting the reality of a transfer of resources to the top that our tax code executes. And so I want to leave you with some resources. Maine Center for Economic Policy, my assumption is most of you all are aware of our work if you're on this Zoom call, but I know that we had put this information out more broadly to people who may not be as familiar. So if you want to wonk out, please visit our website, check out those materials. Maine for Tax Fairness is kind of a home for people who want to advocate for tax fairness. We have a 5 calls type interface there. So when we're in legislative session, pay attention to that. If you want to engage, talk to your lawmaker at the state level or at the federal level, that's a good resource there. And we're part of the coalition that sort of stands that up. And then there are 2 books I would highly recommend for folks who want to really nerd out on this. The Price of Democracy is by Vanessa Williamson. She recently did a great interview with Heather Cox Richardson that talks about our tax system and its relationship to our democracy. She actually stopped Heather in her tracks, which is something I've hardly ever seen, so I'd commend that to you. And then finally, The Second Estate, which is a book by Ray Madoff. She recently had an interview with Ezra Klein. If you don't have time to read the book, you can listen to that interview. But again, she really peels back the cover on this dynamic of how we reward wealth over work in our tax code and offers up some suggestions on how we can address that. So get your questions in the chat as you, if you have any, but I want to leave you with one last thought related to this topic. Again, the cost of living challenges that we're facing now, there are some near-term things that are being done that are impacting that directly, but we ultimately need to appreciate the longer view of these issues. And so that's an important piece of the puzzle and how we get to better solutions. But the thing that we really need to get comfortable with is this understanding that some people who showed up at a tax day rally that we held a couple of years last year did, which is tax the rich. They'll still be rich.